So one of the big changes today that you guys have probably already noticed is that I've changed the name of the game. It was originally called Luminus with a U in the name, but now I've decided to call it Luminoes. Sort of like a take on dominoes in a sense. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I did this. The first is that there's already a game out there called Luminus, spelled with an E, and even though it's a similar name, it's not really so close that I was too worried about it, but it is something that did come up. And the other thing too is that coming up with a name that uses the word luminous or illumination in any sort of way that doesn't contradict an existing trademark from some company that offers some sort of product based on just sort of raw material or something, there's all of them. There's just all taken. It's like you want to put luminous with an X in it somewhere, just forget about it. It's like every combination's been taken. So Luminous is one that wasn't really taken. And the other thing too is when I was thinking about how I wanted to do the patterns of the enemies coming on the screen, I realized that there was kind of a sort of, how do you put it? Kind of like that idea of the sort of cascading effect that you would get with dominoes. So I thought that maybe having luminous combined with a domino sort of word might have worked out well. So hence the new name of the game project is Luminoes. And if it changes again, well, oh well. You got to make sure that things like this are going to be something you don't hold on to too strictly. Otherwise, well, you're not going to make much progress. You got to be ready to change things if it makes sense to do so. So the first thing I wanted to get started with after I changed the name is getting the progression figured out. Now, if I wanted to take the lazy approach, I could just make it so that the levels had random layouts of enemies and everything. But even that's not that lazy, because you still have to figure out how you're going to do your randomization and your procedural content and everything so that it stays balanced to some degree. Now, given the fact that I'm going for 100 levels, I figured maybe the better thing to do would be to actually lay out the progression. Now, I had some trouble with this at first. My original thinking was to have it so that part of the progression was also what weapons the enemies would be using, along with how fast they were moving. But this kind of didn't tie in very well. It didn't make the enemies feel unique to any sort of degree. And as I was putting the progression together, I was also putting together the enemies that were going to make up these different levels. So I came up with a different approach where the enemies would actually now have their own individual weapons and potential movement speeds and everything. And I feel that's going to work out better in the long run. Also, ironically enough, one really basic mistake I made while I was putting together the initial progression tables is I accidentally made all the regular enemies just have 1 hit point. See, one of the things I was doing was I was making sure to keep track of the total hit points. That way I'd have an idea of how long each level was going to last. Because I wanted to make sure that the levels last a certain amount of time when they're being played optimally. And in order for that to make sense, you need to have an idea of how many hit points of damage the player has to deal in order to clear the level. And so I kind of had the calculations wrong at first, so I had to fix that, and that did change my numbers around a bit. Another interesting thing I ended up doing was putting together how I was going to make the bosses work. Now, there's a couple things to keep note of about the bosses. The first thing is that every boss level still has a normal level in front of the boss that you have to clear first before the boss appears. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the bosses have a large number of hit points, and this is so that the battle will actually take a decent amount of time. Now, I still don't want it to take forever. If you've got optimal weapons, a boss fight's only going to take between 12 and 20 seconds, depending on how well you aim. But one of the things I had to keep in mind is that, first of all, the bosses have to be unique in some way. Otherwise, they're just going to be boring. So I ended up coming up with a way of programming the bosses. So you would actually consider this sort of like attack patterns in a sense. So if you look at the first program here for the very first boss called Axial Flight, you'll see that he has a sort of program that I've put in, which determines sort of how the boss is going to react. Now there's going to be some very basic stuff that the boss does on its own, but this sort of pseudocode here is going to determine how the attack patterns play out. The other thing too is that the bosses like every single boss, will have the ability to release smaller enemies, basically the standard size enemies. And there's a couple reasons why all the bosses need to do this. The first reason is just to sort of change things up a bit, so that the bosses do seem to be more prominent and massive than any of the other enemies, I should say. But the other thing too is that what if the player loses weapon power in the middle of a boss battle? Like, I mean, we've already established that the combo weapon system, if you've got a max comboed weapon, you could be doing 64 damage per second, but if you suddenly lose all of that because you lose a life, you're suddenly down to 16. And that means you're doing 75% less damage against the boss. So if a boss has been balanced out to take 15 seconds to destroy with the optimal weapon combinations, then that's suddenly going to take a full minute of attacks, and that's assuming you don't even miss. So one of the things that actually is going to happen in the boss battles is that the small enemies released by the bosses are going to be far more likely to drop weapon power-ups that'll help boost your weapons up. That way, if you do end up dying in the middle of a boss battle, you do have a chance to restore your power and thus be able to defeat the boss in a reasonable amount of time. And something I should point out with the boss names as well is that I was kind of going for a similar approach to how the boss names are in games like Gunstar Heroes or games like the Darius series. I wanted to try and give the bosses that kind of name where it sort of sounds like two words that you would never put together and yet somehow makes for a name that seems very non-specific. Again, if you play games like Darius or Gunstar Heroes, you know exactly the kind of names I'm talking about. And I also, just for fun, decided to make him alphabetized, or however you say that, just so that the first boss on level 10, his name starts with an A, and then the boss on level 20 starts with a B, boss on level 30 starts with a C, etc. Although I think I'm going to break that for the very final boss on level 100, but maybe not. We'll see.